What's going on, everybody? My name is Dylan, and I love to make some very weird and quite odd things for my chameleons. And in this video, I'm going to be doing some major camception. So a few months ago, I went to a reptile show and picked up these baby rearing bins. And essentially what they are is little bins that you raise new clutches of chameleons in until they're ready to go to individual enclosures. And when I bought them, I thought I had more horizontal space than I do, and they don't fit horizontally. So what I'm gonna be doing here is making a rack to go within this chrome rack that has drawers on it so that I can stack the cages and pull them out and easily access them. But before we get into that, if you like what you see here, you're entertained, or you learned something from this video, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button and like the video so that others can find it as well. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into the build. In order to get my bearings and figure out where to start on this project, I first rendered a 3D image of this rack that I'm doing. I like using this computer program called Sketchup, which essentially allows me to design a 3D rendered image of the project I'm doing and determine what size each piece of that project needs to be before I pull out all the tools. At any rate, you can see how this rack is going to come together with the drawers and the lights and so on and so forth. Once my plans were completed, I pulled out my table saw and started cutting down all of the lumber for this project. I started off by creating the drawers, and the way I'm assembling these drawers is by making a square frame and then inserting a 1/8 inch piece of melamine on the bottom. And in order to do that, I need to create little grooves in the bottom at which that melamine can sit. Whenever screwing two boards together, my joinery of choice is using pocket hole screws. I've gone over this method in a number of other videos, so I won't go over it much here. If at any point you need to join two pieces of wood together, you could obviously use the pocket hole method, or if you don't want to invest in a pocket hole jig, you could always butt joint the pieces of wood together using some regular old wood screws. I just like using pocket holes because they ensure that the joinery is as strong as possible. Now that the grooves in the bottom of the drawer frames were cut out and the drawer frames themselves were assembled, I could then proceed to cut the melamine, which would then be installed into the bottoms of those drawer frames. Once the melamine pieces were cut, I dry fit them just to make sure that they fit and that everything on the bottom of that drawer was flush. With the drawers just about finished, I needed to then cut out the lumber for the rack itself. And once that lumber was cut out, I assembled it the same way as the drawers using pocket hole screws. Getting the sides and the back attached can be quite tricky on your own, so if you're doing something like this, I would highly suggest getting somebody to help you hold things in place while you screw it in. Otherwise, do like I did and use clamps and mark the wood accordingly so that everything turns out as square as possible. Once the frame of the rack was put together and the frames of the drawers were put together, I then glued in the bottoms of the drawers into the drawer frames. I then used a pneumatic nailer to really hold that bottom in place. And a lot of people don't have one of these, and you could always use finishing nails and a hammer here if you wanted to. When using the pocket hole method, it kind of leaves a little crater, if you will, in the side of the wood where the screws get installed. And in order to hide those, I used some pocket hole plugs and glued those in. This is not completely necessary, but since this rack will be exposed to high amounts of humidity, I tried to make the wood as sealed as possible so that nothing rusts or absorbs moisture and bloats out. And after gluing in those plugs, I'll wait for that glue to dry and then cut down the excess part of the plug and sand it so that the plug is flush with the rest of the lumber. The next thing I did was use some wood filler and filled in any gaps or any parts of the wood that would potentially be exposed after doing a paint job. Now, my number one suggestion to anybody that's also wanting to make things for any sort of reptile that dwells in high humidity climates is to make sure things are properly sealed. It's always a fear of mine cutting corners and then having to go back and fix something because I was too lazy to do something initially. Anyhow, from there, I got my orbital sander and sanded the entire project. And following the sanding, I gave it a sweet, sweet paint job with some outdoor graded paint. And it was at this point that I decided to pull a classic Dylan move and add little parts to the project that I had not originally planned to. And what is that, you might ask? That was adding feet to this rack. And the reason I decided to add feet to this rack was because I was thinking about it, and with the way I have this whole thing designed is that the bottom drawer would be dragging on the ground. So in order to remedy the bottom drawer dragging on the floor, I went ahead and put these feet on to raise it up about 1/4 of an inch. Alternatively, I could have thought of that issue before I started making this project, and instead of having to go back and redo a lot of things, I figured doing feet would give me that extra height so that that drawer wouldn't drag when pulling out or sliding back in. Once those feet were installed, I went ahead and proceeded at installing the drawer slides onto the frame of this rack. And once those sides of the drawer slides were installed, I went ahead and added the other sides to the drawers. I tested out drawer number 1 and it fit beautifully. I was actually rather surprised that it did. I then installed the second drawer the same way as the first, and then installed my drawer handles onto those drawers. Once my drawer slides were installed, I then test fit those baby rearing bins on the drawers to make sure that everything was coming together nicely. And this is when I noticed a huge issue. Since there was no brace or support going across the front of that rack, whenever pulling out those drawers, the sides of the rack wanted to kind of boat out, which made the drawer slides want to pull away from each other. In order to fix that issue, I went ahead and added a brace across the center front of the rack. Additionally, I added a brace across the bottom of the rack to really ensure that these sides were not going to bow out any longer. I tested my drawers once again, and it was a great success because the sides of the rack no longer bowed outward. Once I was content with those braces, I went ahead and added some paint to them. Just when I thought I could wrap up this project, boy, was I wrong. There was actually another issue here. Simply put, the issue that I was having now was that the drawer slides did not install the way I had imagined that they would, and they actually had the drawer sitting higher than I anticipated. So with the extra height that the drawer slides would hold the drawers at, the lights would not fit in this rack the way that I wanted. So I needed to raise them up just a bit, like maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch, not very much. So I added some wood shims underneath where the lights would be installed. Luckily, I had anticipated some sort of issue like this with the lights, so I did leave myself a little bit of extra room in the middle of that rack so that those shims could be installed. Something I did not take into consideration, though, was the height of the baby rearing bins in addition to the hinges on top of them. Now that that center brace was installed, the hinges of the bottom baby rearing bins did not clear that brace. This issue was a little bit more challenging to fix because that brace in the center was permanently installed, and unless I wanted to saw it off, then there's nothing I could really do about it. So what I went ahead and did was lowered that bottom drawer's drawer slides, and when I did that, that drawer then interfered with the brace on the bottom of the rack. And in order to fix that issue, I went ahead and sandwiched some spare pieces of lumber in between the bottom brace and the rack. I also made the feet a little taller to compensate for the extra height on that bottom brace. At this point, I was rather glad that I decided to install those feet, because if I hadn't yet, then I definitely would have now. And after all of these tweaks, things finally started to come together as I had originally anticipated. If you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I do incorporate footage of my mess-ups, and you'll know that I take the time to explain how I fix said mess-ups. The reason for this is because if anybody watches my videos or another creator's videos and are encouraged or motivated to make something of their own for their reptiles or what have you, then they'll know that, things don't always go according to plan, and it involves some creative problem solving. At any rate, from there I went ahead and finished creating the shims which would go under the lights. I had to glue a couple of them together to make sure that they were the right height, but once they were all done, I went ahead and painted them and then glued them into place. If I didn't mention it before, the reason for putting the shims underneath the lights was to raise the lights up so that they'd be high enough to where the rearing bins wouldn't get caught on them or rub against them. From there, I needed a way to ensure that the lights wouldn't slide off the rack on either side. I went ahead and concocted these little notch-like tab things. I'm sure there's a better way to describe them, but I just took some scrap pieces of lumber and shaped them down into this little planchette-looking shape. And then I put a hole in them, which would allow me to put a screw through and allow these little things, whatever they're called, to rotate freely. I added a coat of black paint to them and then screwed them into the sides of the rack as you see in the video. I screwed these wood pieces onto the rack a little bit loose instead of gluing them, because if I ever need to remove those light fixtures, it's as easy as rotating those pieces either left or right and removing the light. I went ahead and did some final tests just to ensure that everything was still coming together as planned. I went ahead and cleaned out those rearing bins and furnished them, followed by placing them in their respective drawers. I went ahead and cleared out the space on this metal rack where the wooden rack would be living. I then took some extra 1/8 inch melamine that I had laying around and placed it on the metal rack. That way the wooden rack's feet wouldn't fall through the spaces in between the wire on that metal rack. Once the wooden rearing rack, say that 5 times fast. Once the wooden rearing rack was in place on the metal rack, I then powered on the lights once I plugged them in. And luckily, everything turned out as I had hoped, and everything functioned quite beautifully. I'm rather surprised that this actually did turn out because of how precise I had to be with this project, but it's there and it works, and there's baby chameleons in them now, so let's go see those. Let's baby chameleons. Yeah, I'll shut up. Let's just, yeah, okay, Dylan, stop talking. Okay. That pretty much concludes the video. I do want to take a moment to let everyone know that the baby chameleons pictured in the footage of this video are both Smoke and Akasha babies, as well as Osiris and Belladonna babies. These chameleons will be ready to go to new trees in about 3 months once they've had enough time to establish. If you're interested in one of these chameleons, then you can reserve one at magicalchams.com. If you're seeking a cam companion and are looking for something a little sooner than that, then there are some older Smoke and Akasha babies which you can also reserve at magicalchams.com. Thank you to everyone who's watched through the end of this video, and if you haven't already, I do highly encourage you to subscribe to the channel, as it does help out quite tremendously. If you were entertained by this video, or inspired, or you just simply enjoyed watching me create this project, then go ahead and hit the like button so that others can find this video across YouTube as well. If you have any questions about this video, or any cam-related questions in general, then go ahead and leave them in the comments below. You can also reach out via Instagram, that's at Magickal Chams, or on Facebook, that's facebook.com/magicalchams, and you can also send out an email to magicalchams@gmail.com. Thank you again, and I wish you good luck on your DIY creating journey.